Frustrated by Saddam Hussein's 10-year-long refusal to disarm,
You take your hand off my inspector now.
the United States was prepared to act, and act alone if necessary, to topple the Iraqi dictator with the blunt force of the U.S. military. Operation Iraqi Freedom provided a stunning display of American military might, tactical skill, and courage. Reporters embedded with the troops gave the world a front row seat as the U.S. and its allies pummeled Iraq with a combination of high-tech weapons and down-home grit.
Push it out, son.
U.S. and British
But
forces
because
have-
embedded reporters could only bring viewers slices of the war, no one got a complete picture of what was going on until now. While tanks and planes and troops did the actual fighting, what won the war in Iraq was something no one saw. Amazing advances in command and control that played out far from the cameras. Now, the History Channel brings you that story of fast and flexible troops, led even before the war began by the largest deployment of elite special forces in U.S. history. What made special forces, as well as other coalition troops, so effective was a seamless communications network which allowed them to react to new information almost immediately, not in days and weeks and months, but in hours and even minutes. Nowhere was the new flexibility more evident than in the opening hours of the war on March 19th, when General Tommy Franks, head of the coalition forces, got a huge tip.
The first night, General Franks was given an intelligence estimate or an intelligence observation that there might be an opportunity to strike at the leadership of the Iraqi regime.
An informant told American officials that Saddam Hussein and other Iraqi leaders were meeting that night at a bunker underneath a government complex called Dora Farms, just south of Baghdad. It was a chance for the coalition to end the war in Iraq before it even began, by killing Saddam. General Franks asked Air War Commander Lieutenant General Michael Mosley how they should strike the target. And Mosley, in turn, asked Major Clint Highnote, his in-house expert on the capabilities of the F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighter.
He looked at me and he said, here's the answer that we owe the president. Can we do this mission? And if so, what is the risk? And I can just remember just that split second going, wow, this is really going to happen. I said, sir, we can do this, but I think the risk is going to be pretty high. And high risk in the military has a certain connotation, and what it means is there's a good chance that people won't be coming home.
The concern was that any plane, even the nearly invisible F-117, could be attacked by the heavy air defenses Saddam had set up around Baghdad.
They have so much what we call anti-aircraft artillery, or AAA. They could just put up walls of lead if they wanted to.
So, to ensure the success of the mission, the plan didn't just rely on bombers.
I had a discussion with General Franks about we can use a combination of cruise missiles and penetrating weapons. We need the penetrating weapons to come through or to penetrate the top of the bunker. Use the cruise missiles around to clean up the rest of the structure.
Mosley decided to send 2 F-117s, which would each drop 2 one-ton bunker busters. As President George W. Bush and his advisors weighed whether to go ahead with the strike, stealth pilot Lieutenant Colonel David Toomey got a call at his base in Qatar.
And they said, hey, we've got an emerging target, a target of opportunity. We're waiting for approval from above, and we think that you guys are the right platform to go strike it.
Over the next 2 hours, planners mapped a route and prepared photos of the target. Crews loaded enhanced GBU-27 bombs, which could be aimed using laser pointers or pre-programmed with exact coordinates using global positioning satellites. It would be the first time the bombs were used. In the meantime, Toomey waited anxiously in the cockpit for approval from above.
One of the tactical advantages that we try to take advantage of, if you will, is darkness. The airplane is optimized to go out and fly in the dark. So now we're running the risk of the sun's going to start coming up, and now we're going to fly over the most heavily defended portion of Iraq, and we can be seen.
At 3:30 a.m. on March 20th, at the last possible moment, the call came. President Bush gave the go-ahead. Toomey and the second pilot, Major Mark Hone, took off and flew north over Saudi Arabia. Once in the air, Colonel Toomey had trouble with one of his bombs.
The weapon reports to me in the airplane how it's doing. And after I got my gas and I was proceeding to the target area, I got an indication that it was having problems with its global positioning system.
A fault light had come on, just like the warning lights on a car's dashboard.
Pull out my checklist. Okay, the orange light's on. I know the orange light is bad. How do I make the orange light go away? And it was just a series of, okay, I'm going to go through the steps. Went through the steps, waited the appropriate amount of time, light went out, lights out, and I probably checked it 700 times in the next 30 seconds to make sure the light stayed out. And the light did stay out, and I was able to press on.
Colonel Toomey approached the target, Dora Farms, from the west. Major Hone came in from the east. As they approached, there was a thick cloud cover. That helped protect them from air defenses, but it meant they couldn't see the target well. In the end, they had a clear view of the ground for only 6 seconds.
So we came in 180 degrees out from each other, and we dropped 4 2,000-pound weapons on this underground bunker at 5:30 in the morning.
Two pilots in the F-117s flew the airplanes into the missile engagement zone that we had not attacked and dropped their 4 weapons exactly where we told them to drop them. Great Americans doing great work.
The entire mission took 4 hours.
All that training paid off because we got notified, I think, around 1:30 in the morning, and we had bombs on target 4 hours later.
I would tell you that this is a wonderful example of time-sensitive targeting.
The speed and flexibility on display that first night were shown again and again throughout the war. In Operation Iraqi Freedom, U.S. forces were able to take real-time information and immediately change their game plan to get weapons on a target, showing flexibility unprecedented in the history of warfare. In many ways, the force structure of U.S. troops in Iraq was the brainchild of Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld.
Donald Rumsfeld believed our capacity to deliver fires accurately with great precision and with great lethality meant that we could do far more with less. And so the planning process really was a great debate over how many and what ways would they be used, and that evolved for much of the fall of 2002.
In January 2002, President Bush asked Secretary Rumsfeld and General Franks for possible scenarios to strike Iraq. Franks, the head of Central Command, which includes the Mideast region, began working from a war plan called Victor 1003, devised years earlier to respond to a threat of another Iraqi invasion of Kuwait.
Initially, when we started out, the plan was very much like the first war. It was a large buildup of forces. If we had 600,000 when we crossed the line of departure to secure Kuwait, then we would have probably about that many the next time, if not more.
It was, I think, quickly realized that this was not the optimum plan. It not only presumed a tremendous amount of time to bring in a lot of forces, but given the circumstances, political as well as military, it was a plan that would require too much warning to the adversary, too much vulnerability for U.S. forces.
So began months of planning to come up with a new approach to attacking Iraq. Rumsfeld and Franks agreed to send in a maximum of 250 to 300,000 ground troops, a much smaller force than in the first Gulf War.
It was 40% smaller. That was no small thing. But it was, if you will, more than 40% better. This was a military that now was suffused with precision weapons. It had a level of communications through satellites, through radios, that they didn't have in the last war.
With better communications and joint training, all the services could operate together in a new way in 2003. The military calls it jointness.
Army, Navy, Air Force units were all more familiar with working together, and their systems were designed to interoperate. And so it was possible for an Army unit on the ground to communicate directly to an Air Force bomber overhead or to a Navy unit offshore. It was all one seamless network.
This whole idea of jointness is to fundamentally take the best of all the services and combine it in such a way that the impact is greater than the sum of the parts.
With jointness a priority, Secretary Rumsfeld wanted the Marines to play a major role in the war. So ground forces would include 60,000 members of the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force. He liked the ability of the MEF, as they're known, to move quickly with a full mix of weaponry, including one component the Army lacks.
Of course, when the MEF comes to play, we bring a lot of airplanes with us, and it gives us a tremendous amount of combat power.
The power of the MEF made a difference, though, there, because it wasn't just ground forces. We had this outfit called the 3rd Marine Air Wing. And I will tell you, frankly, it's a killing machine, employed in the right fashion.
The mission for all the ground troops was to reach Baghdad as quickly as possible and try to decapitate the regime by removing Saddam.
The psychology and the culture of Iraq has always been centered in Baghdad, so a main effort to immediately go and isolate Baghdad, and then a supporting effort to fix both regular Army and Republican Guard forces over in the eastern part of Iraq.
Brilliant. Brilliant. What you wanted to do, the notion here was to get rid of Saddam. And so the way to do that was to race to Baghdad, seize the capital, seize the levers of power, and once that was done, then one could go around mopping up the rest of the country.
The first version of the plan, however, did not call for a fast assault on Baghdad. Assuming that war could be declared as early as January 2003, the plan used only the 50,000 troops already stationed in the Mideast. With such a small force, planners drew up a strategy to occupy southern Iraq up to Nasiriyah, where they would dig in and wait for reinforcements. It would take an estimated 6 months to take Baghdad. When the war did not start in January, the Pentagon told planners they would eventually have 250,000 ground troops to work with, mostly U.S. and British forces. Despite U.S. appeals to both the UN and NATO, few other nations provided troops to what the Bush administration called the Coalition of the Willing. Working with 250,000 troops, Army planners went back to the drawing board to come up with a new approach.
And we got the order, and it was focused around all these units being available for the start of the campaign. Well, that night, about 5 or 6 of us sat down, a bunch of majors, sat around the map, and in the course of about 6 hours came up with a new concept.
With more troops now on the way, they considered a bold new strategy.
I wanted to stay out in the west, stay out in the desert, where we could optimize our armor force, our maneuverability, and our speed.
We would initially go to Nasiriyah and Samoa, as the original plan had us going, but then we'd take basically a hard left turn and go out into the desert in order to move faster, bypass a lot of the urban areas, and get to Baghdad as quickly as possible.
Much faster than the 6 months in the original plan. There was another bold element to the plan. Instead of conducting a month-long air war followed by ground troops, as they did in the first Gulf War, the coalition would begin with a brief but punishing air campaign, labeled shock and awe in the media. The ground war would launch 48 hours later.
The Gulf War was very much like fighting World War II, so it was really sequential. What we saw clearly in this war is if it was not sequential. You had air and ground operating from the get-go, together.
On the ground, the plan called for a force of 25,000 British troops to take the southern portion of Iraq, primarily Basra, the second largest city. To the south, the Army's 3rd Infantry Division would come in from Kuwait and roll swiftly through the desert toward Baghdad. The 1st Marine Expeditionary Force would also come in from the south and move on a parallel track toward Baghdad, but through the more heavily populated Tigris River Valley. Finally, the Army's 4th Infantry Division would come in through Turkey to the north. They would all converge on Baghdad in a classic pincer. The plan was audacious and a major change from the first Gulf War.
It was more flexible, more fluid. It was more ad hoc. It's kind of like comparing an orchestra playing a symphony to a jazz quartet doing an improvisation.
One of the key instruments in this improvisational war would be special forces, who would secure crucial sites in Iraq even before the war began. In early 2003, as the war's architects put the finishing touches on Victor 1003, the Bush administration began sending tens of thousands of troops to the Middle East, both openly and covertly. Leading the way were U.S. Special Operations Forces. They would play a major role in Iraq.
Special Forces probably had a larger role in this operation than in any large-scale military operation the United States has carried out.
Approximately 1 in 10 U.S. ground forces were Special Operations Forces, or about 10,000.
They create chaos, and they create uncertainty on the part of the opponent. So when you have Special Operating Forces that are operating behind your defenses at places of their choosing, not of the defender's choosing, that gives the attacker a great advantage.
So, as television audiences watched conventional forces mass in Kuwait, unconventional forces moved inside Iraq.
Before the war started, they engaged in advanced force operations, taking down Iraqi positions in the south to clear, and in the west to clear the way for the ground force advance.
In northern Iraq, Army Special Forces performed the same mission they had the previous year in the Bush administration's successful war against Afghanistan. They worked with the Kurds, an ethnic minority who opposed Saddam's regime and had their own resistance force ready to fight.
There were forces that were operating on temporary basis inside Iraq, both in the north to support the Kurds, or at least make contact with the Kurdish independence fighters.
The special forces in Iraq trained the Kurds, fought alongside them, and called in airstrikes against the Iraqi forces in the north. It was almost a duplicate of their role in Afghanistan.
To be able to put those special teams out there, to have eyes on the target, and to be able to bring munitions to bear quickly on a specific target, we found that to be very, very effective in Afghanistan.
In addition, Special Forces helped prevent the Iraqis from firing Scud missiles from the western desert. In 1991, the Iraqis fired almost 90 Scuds, many at Israel, in an attempt to disrupt the coalition that supported the United States in the Gulf War. Then, U.S. officials managed to keep Israel from retaliating. But in 2003, the U.S. was fearful of what the Israelis might do to defend themselves.
If there were an attack against Israel with a Scud missile with chemical warheads or something worse, then clearly Israeli retaliation could have been severe, who knows with what, but if they attacked in kind with weapons of mass destruction, it would have changed the entire calculus.
Even before the war officially began, Special Forces secured 2 major air bases in the western desert. From there, they directed airstrikes against any mobile missile launchers they found.
When the history books are written, controlling 2/5 of Iraq with a very small force, but with a lot of capability, either due to mobility or the equipment they have or the air power that was connected to them, we're able to control this large area in Iraq throughout the conflict.
As Special Forces spread out across Iraq, intelligence agencies helped the coalition gauge the strength of Saddam's army.
We generally knew that the size of his military was about 1/3 of what it had been during Desert Shield and Desert Storm. We knew that his capabilities were somewhat diminished because of the embargo and the difficulty of him getting resupply, things of that nature.
We also knew that during the last 14 years that they've been trying to procure a lot of advanced weapon systems. As far as air defense goes, we felt very confident that they had procured some very nasty little air defense systems.
Months before, coalition planes began a low-level war against Iraq's air defenses. Since the last Gulf War, the U.S. and Great Britain had maintained a no-fly zone over southern Iraq to discourage another Iraqi attempt to invade Kuwait. In June 2002, 9 months before Operation Iraqi Freedom, they started using more aggressive tactics.
We began an operation that we called Southern Focus, which was really an attempt to negate those systems that were using a variety of sources to find the aircraft in the no-fly zone and engage them.
Every time American planes were shot at, pilots targeted not only the gun or missile launcher that fired, but also the communications and supply lines that kept those positions operating, including the fiber optic cables that connected Baghdad to the southern cities.
Yes, the no-fly zone offered an opportunity to go up and attack those systems in self-defense. Now, as it turned out, what that provided was an opportunity to gain air superiority south of Baghdad pre-Operation Iraqi Freedom.
But the early air campaign did not target the biggest worry of the commanders, Saddam's suspected arsenal of weapons of mass destruction. UN inspectors searched Iraq for years after the first Gulf War, finding laboratories and stockpiles of weapons. After being kicked out in 1998, they were allowed back under threat of UN action to search again in late 2002 and early 2003. But they found no evidence of unconventional weapons. Still, the coalition prepared for the worst.
We sincerely believed that this guy had chemical and biological weapons, and that when you looked at his overall arsenal, his overall military capability, this was probably the most potent thing that he had. And so the likelihood of him using it was something that, you know, was always in the forefront of people's minds.
So I have to make my guys prepared for the most difficult situation that they could face. In my heart of heart, I thought there would be no chemical use during this. I told everybody that I could talk to before, I really believe that there will be no chemical use. But I'm going to make sure that you guys are prepared.
But it was not just danger from Iraq that war planners would have to deal with. There would also be challenges from America's own allies. The architects of Operation Iraqi Freedom had to be flexible even before the war began. On March 1st, 2003, Turkey's parliament refused to allow the U.S. to send troops through Turkey, a member of NATO, into Iraq. A fiercely secular country since the days of Kemal Ataturk after the end of World War I, Turks had elected a Muslim government for only the second time since the creation of modern Turkey in 1923. Turkey's refusal meant the 4th Infantry Division, the heaviest and best equipped force in the U.S. Army, could not attack from the north as planned and provide a second front moving toward Baghdad.
The Turkish decision meant that the Iraqis didn't have to look in two directions at the same time for U.S. or coalition forces coming at them. They only had to focus in one direction. They only had to focus on the supply lines on one axis, not on two.
It also meant that the ground force, which some generals already thought was too small at 250,000 troops, would now be much smaller and lighter. Only the 3rd Infantry Division and the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force would advance to Baghdad.
Instead of having this force which was larger and more reflective of those people who were conservative, we went in with a very modest force of perhaps 150,000 ground troops.
Nevertheless, General Franks told the administration he would start the war with the forces he had, and at the same time put other troops in motion heading toward the region in case he needed them. He called it a rolling start.
The difference between Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and Iraqi Freedom was that General Franks did not insist upon having all the forces that he might need in the theater at the time he initiated the combat.
But before revealing his decision, General Franks used the Turkish situation to his advantage.
It was actually part of his deception plan. It was part of his attempt to achieve tactical surprise on the battlefield. General Franks kept the 4th Division pre-positioning ships in the Mediterranean with the impression that he, General Franks, would probably not launch this campaign unless we got permission to put the 4th ID ashore in Turkey.
As the diplomatic maneuvering continued, the coalition's ground troops, more than 100,000 of them, massed at the border between Iraq and Kuwait. Cramming so many troops into such a small area left them vulnerable to Iraqi arms, short-range missiles, and even long-range artillery, possibly loaded with chemical weapons. Once the war began, with the decapitation strike against Saddam on March 20th, they were even more vulnerable. In fact, 5 hours after the first strike, an Iraqi version of a cruise missile called a seersucker landed near the Marines' camp.
There was a big scare. There was an explosion, so we all had to get in our chemical protective gear. And that was a little antsy, a little scary.
It turned out the missile was not loaded with chemical weapons, but it still rattled the Americans.
It's about 500K of explosives, and it went off about 100 meters from the MEF headquarters. Got everybody's attention, knocked me out of my chair. So it appeared that he was going to begin doing a preemptive attack.
Although the plan called for a 2-day air campaign before the ground troops launched, the commanders now decided to start the ground war early. General Franks had the flexibility to change the plan at the last minute because the coalition already had air dominance over southern Iraq.
One of the keys to success in the Iraq major combat phase was the fact that we did have complete air superiority from day one.
I did not see any instance where I thought operational or strategic leadership provided coherent direction to Iraqi forces. I don't think you can be more effective than that.
Before ground forces could cross the border from Kuwait into Iraq, the Army and Marines needed to breach the border fortifications.
The demilitarized zone on the border was lined up with a series of obstacles. Berms, fences, ditches, more fences which were electrified, another ditch, another berm.
Dozers would go through, and then we had AVLB teams that would come behind. They would put a bridge down, a bridge in about 5 minutes or less on top of the anti-tank ditch, and the forces would stream across. And then we did the same thing on the next objective, and then we just kept on pushing guys across.
As the engineers worked, cavalry and other troops protected them.
If you're trying to go through a minefield or a berm or any type of obstacle, as soon as you come up with the engineer assets, boom, enemy knows right there. That's where they're going to focus their fires. If they can kill that dozer, if they can kill the 113 and the engineers, if they can destroy the Miklik and the bridge layer or any other engineer assets, they've stopped you. Because a tank can't go through a berm. A Bradley can't go through a berm.
Once the engineers finished, ground forces streamed across the border into Iraq. The Army's 3rd Infantry Division was the first to launch at 8 p.m. on March 20th.
When that radio call came, it was a breathtaking experience in the talk, knowing that, hey, we've trained for this for 6 months. Everybody that's been in the Army for 10 years may have never done this, but here we are, and this is real, and we're going. We're going to Iraq, and we're going all the way.
The Iraqis were waiting for them.
What we saw very early on across the border as the artillery started to fall is that there were more things coming in and out of the border area, specifically like trucks, people shooting small arms from, there's a whole host of old, from the Gulf War, armored graveyards out there of old armored vehicles. We started taking small arms fire up to pretty heavy machine gun fire from within those. And so, you know, dust is blowing, artillery's falling, first time in combat for kids.
It was a scene that would be repeated all across the border that night. For most of the Army's 3rd Infantry Division, crossing the border from Kuwait to Iraq was uneventful. The most impressive sight on the horizon was the Army itself.
You know, 5 kilometers past that border outpost, we saw nothing but desert for 100 miles or so. It was just open, barren desert. But tanks, Bradleys, all in a column, moving across the desert, headed north to Iraq for a long trip.
When we move, we like to have our helicopters between 1 and 3 kilometers in front of us, giving us early warning. We also had Air Force with us. We had 3 enlisted tactical air control teams And so we had everything the Air Force had available that was in the air at our disposal if we needed it.
One battalion of the 1st Brigade was detached to take the Jalaba Air Base, due south of Nasiriyah.
It had been in the past an existing military runway. We wanted to get our Apache helicopter battalion from the division up there and all of their resupply, because what it does is, as the Apaches are committed, then it gives them a shorter turn when they have to come and get fuel and ammunition.
They quickly took the airbase. The rest of the 3rd ID began racing through the uninhabited desert toward Baghdad. It was a force of 21,000 troops, riding in the 2 workhorse vehicles of the U.S. military, 250 of the largest and most heavily armored tanks, the M1A1s, and hundreds of Bradley fighting vehicles, which were lighter but still resistant to enemy attacks. The 2nd Brigade was out front. They decided to separate their tanks and Bradleys from their slower-moving vehicles so the armor could move as quickly as possible.
There was very little support with those tanks, and they went completely independent, no fire support. So it was a little bit of a risk and unconventional. Ended up allowing the brigade to go further and faster than any armored formation of that size in history, as far as we know.
Shortly after the Army launched the ground war, the Marines pushed across the border near Safwan Hill. Unlike the first Gulf War, there was much less news coverage of the Marines during this war, because the Army was the lead force and had most of the high-profile embedded reporters. But in the end, the Marines, whose role was to support the Army's attack, did more of the fighting.
As a supporting attack, you do what you can to try to look like a main attack. Try to draw as much attention as you can from the main attack, and pick a fight with everybody that'll pay attention to you, to the extent that they're now focused on you and not on these people that are about to land a heavy blow. So we knew that was going to be the requirement.
Before the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, or MEF, attacked, its 3rd Air Wing spent 8 hours preparing the crossing for the ground troops.
There was border outposts all along the Kuwaiti-Iraq border. Those were designed to, give the Iraqis warning. So it was our plan to take those out with Cobra gunships and Huey gunships. In every one of those cases, every outpost was destroyed before the ground side went across the border. So we completely took out the eyes of the Iraqis right away at the beginning of the war.
Still, the crossing at Safwan Hill was a challenge for the Marines. For one thing, they attacked earlier than they expected.
Our attack was moved back 24 hours to attack at 6 o'clock in the morning of the 21st. And then, on very short notice, in fact, I told the people, okay, you can bed your folks down, nothing's going to happen tonight. Well, about 30 minutes later, I was on the hook saying, okay, tonight's the night.
It was another example of flexibility, of the war plan and the troops carrying it out. But the nighttime launch did pose some challenges for the Marines. It was so dark that their night vision equipment didn't really work.
Not only that, it was compounded by the fact that we had one of the oil fires going off, so it was black smoke everywhere. You couldn't really see other than the one flame that was off in the horizon, which meant helicopters couldn't fly. We didn't have a whole lot of air support, close air support for us as we were going in. It was just it was almost like being on the ocean. There was nothing to break up the horizon at all. Very, very strange.
Some of the Marines ran into resistance immediately.
We got engaged by several tanks, enemy tanks, and the 1st Company through Alpha Company, they met them head on. We had a tank platoon in the lead, and that platoon was kind of reconning by fire as we went through.
Their first target was the Rumaillah oil field. This was Iraq's economic prize, a field that produced 1 million barrels a day before the war and could provide much more. The coalition wanted to keep the Iraqis from setting fire to their reserves. When the Marines reached the oil field that first night, there were already fires burning, which made it even harder to see.
They had dug trenches and filled them with oil and those on fire, which was adding to the confusion.
By the time daylight dawned, the 5th Regiment was in for another surprise.
The next morning, as the sun comes up and we start, getting our bearings, Iraqis are just kind of popping their heads up, forming themselves up in lines and start marching toward us. We ended up with 341 prisoners, and they had all just kind of hunkered down. So they waited till the sun came up, they got out, formed themselves up, and came on in.
But not all the Marines were so lucky. Many units faced isolated but fierce fighting.
As we got into the pumping station the next morning, that's when we started encountering some real resistance. Anyone with a weapon at that time, we were engaging. So we would engage them if they still had a weapon, and they would fire back.
We had about a brigade-size enemy that was in the oil fields. They had artillery, they had some armor, some anti-armor weapon systems. And then we had some unconventional forces. We had a couple of vehicles with machine guns mounted in them, and in fact our first casualties of the war occurred from these vehicles that were unconventional forces in the southern oil fields.
It was in this battle that the U.S. had its first death, Second Lieutenant Terrell Childers. Nevertheless, after a few hours, the Marines quelled the resistance. By midday on March 21st, 12 hours after they launched, they had captured the oil field.
In the end, I think there were 9 wellheads that were destroyed, and there was intent to do a lot more, we discovered, but we were able to prevent that with the early attack.
Now the 1st MEF was free to move north, but the British and American forces fighting in the southeast would not have as much success. They would meet much stiffer resistance in the Al-Faw Peninsula. As U.S. Army and Marine forces crossed the border and moved quickly north toward Baghdad, the British forces had a very different mission. They were to take and hold the south of Iraq, including oil fields and a handful of crucial towns and cities. The main British armored force, Army and Marines, moved quickly toward Basra, Iraq's 2nd largest city, and a stronghold of Shiite Muslims, enemies of Saddam. The British forces' objective was to take and hold the city, a mission that would prove more difficult than anyone expected.
Number 7, fire!
Other British Marines entered Iraq from the Persian Gulf. They would take the Al-Faw Peninsula, which had more oil fields and refineries that needed to be secured. The Brits were helped by the Americans' 15th Marine Expeditionary Unit, or MEU, a small combined force attack team. It was the first time since the Korean War that U.S. Marines fought under another nation's command. The 15th MEU entered Iraq after most of the other forces, and they immediately met with more resistance.
Interestingly, I think as a result of them attacking an hour later, a lot of the enemy had been simply swept aside by 1st Marine Division and by 7 Armoured Brigade, 7 UK Armoured Brigade, and the only way they could move was east. So 15 MEU met all sorts of odds and sods.
You had Iraqi units in uniform, some of whom were giving up, some of whom were not. You had what appeared to be civilians firing upon us with civilian clothes who turned out to be either Ba'ath Party or Fayadeen personnel or even Iraqi military personnel who just changed into their clothes. So it was somewhat confusing early on as to just who the bad guys were.
And the resistance continued as the MEU entered the town of Qasr. Qasr was Iraq's only deep-water port, and access to the Persian Gulf was vitally important to the coalition. They wanted to be able to bring in ships with economic aid as well as military supplies. But the Iraqis were determined to stop that from happening.
Hey, cut your mouth!
Our intelligence had indicated there was probably a reinforced company within the town of Qasr. We later found out that it was probably a brigade-sized unit. And I think what happened was, in the days that led up to our commencement of ground operations, I think that many Iraqi men were picked up in that vicinity by Ba'ath Party and Fayadeen personnel and actually brought down to Qasr and essentially told to fight.
The Iraqis fought the Americans for every street, using tactics that would become all too familiar.
A lot of the Iraqis have been giving up, but they take shots and then they run back to a bunker position, and then they either fight from there or they move back. Mostly this group that's here, that's different from all the other groups, is they fire and then they run and hide again. I think they regroup.
I think it's mainly what we're encountering is this
infantry or Iraqi infantry that's just too cowardly to wear their uniform and stand up and fight us. So they're using basically terrorist techniques to try to inflict onesies and twosies casualties instead of fighting us like men.
Iraqis hold up in buildings, firing rocket-propelled grenades at the Americans.
We took 2 javelin shots, one missed, one hit dead on. They've been moving back and forth from building to building.
As the MEU fought to control Qasr, U.S. Navy SEALs moved to secure another element of Iraq's oil infrastructure: oil transfer stations in the Persian Gulf and the inland pumping stations that fed them. In 1991, Saddam Hussein wreaked havoc by releasing oil from Kuwait's transfer stations.
Reports we had was that one day of spilling oil out of that terminal would have been equivalent to 10 Valdezes every day, 10 of the Exxon Valdezes.
On the first night of the war, March 20th, fighters and bombers swooped in over the inland pumping stations.
5 minutes prior to the helo assault, the fast movers would come in from the carriers. They'd hit the artillery sites. Immediately after they come in, A-10s, low flyers come in and get them closer. Then as the helicopters come in, the HC-130 was available to take any targets that fired on the helicopters themselves.
The air attacks took out some of the enemy, but not all of them.
Our desert patrol vehicles came under heavy, and were using their heavy weapons against mounted forces that would leave. There were individuals in bunkers. As the guys came off of helicopters, they went immediately into bunkers where there were fightings.
The SEALs secured the pumping stations 20 minutes after they landed. As soon as they had them under control, boats carrying more SEAL teams approached the 2 offshore platforms.
Got to the target, and it was lit up like a Christmas tree because it was still operational. So that was a good thing for us in that they couldn't see out onto the water, you know, because they were so illuminated, but yet we could see them from quite a distance.
They climbed the platform silently and were able to surprise the people on board.
No shots were required to be shot because of the stealth, the speed of which we were on top of the people before they could reach weapons.
But once they searched the platform, they realized they were just in time.
We just caught them before they got in place. We found explosives and all kinds of weapons and military uniforms and all military equipment out there, diving equipment. They were going to dive below and set charges underneath the water and make this oil spill.
Now the border and southern oil assets were in coalition hands. Their next important mission was to clear the waterways themselves. Before ships could come into Qasr with much-needed aid, the harbor needed to be checked for mines and booby-trapped boats. As a first step, U.S. Naval Special Warfare teams checked each boat in the harbor to make sure it was safe.
There were mines in the water, of course, but there were also lots of dhows we would seize dhows that had 10, 20 more mines on them before they were put in the water. There were people on board ships who had weapons, who had explosives.
That waterway is littered with old oil tankers or supply ships that are run aground, just left there. We were doing in a waterway something similar as say a SWAT team would do if they cleared a building. They would go from room to room to room and make forward progress. And we tried to do that with a waterway. We went from bottom to top, boat to boat, anything we thought was suspicious.
Once the teams checked the boats in the harbor, the coalition's naval forces searched for mines planted underwater. They used everything from high-tech boats to dolphins to help them. They eventually found 5,000 pieces of suspicious material in the harbor alone. In all, it took 9 days to clear the harbor and the waterways. It wouldn't be until March 28th, several days after the coalition hoped, that the first aid boat could enter Qasr. Meanwhile, towns in the south languished without food or water. And residents became more hostile to the coalition. That hostility, however, was tame compared to what the coalition was about to face. The determined and dangerous Fedayeen.